He didn't expect the day to end in sirens. Elijah Thompson had just left his shift at the warehouse, sweat still clinging to his shirt, the ache in his lower back pulsing from lifting crates all day. He was a 32-year-old father of two, quiet, by nature, loyal to his family and known in his small Alabama town for his patience. He wasn't a man of many words, but the way he treated people, especially his children, spoke louder than anything he could have said. That afternoon, he stopped by the corner store to pick up milk and bread. The sun had just begun to dip, casting long shadows down Main Street. As Elijah exited the store, bag in hand, he noticed a group of teenagers laughing loudly across the parking lot. He smiled slightly, remembering his own younger days, before responsibility had wrapped itself around him like a second skin. But what he didn't see, couldn't have known, was that just minutes earlier, a silent alarm had been triggered nearby. Someone reported a suspicious man lurking. The caller said he matched a certain look. Tall, black, alone. Within moments, 2 patrol cars whipped into the lot, doors flung open. Commands shouted. Elijah froze. He held the plastic grocery bag in one hand, keys in the other. Confusion swept across his face. "Hands up!" one officer screamed. "What did I do?" Elijah asked, slowly raising his hands. They didn't answer. Within seconds, one of them grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back and shoved him to the ground. The other pressed a knee into his back. The bag burst open, spilling milk and bread onto the pavement. A small crowd formed, phones pulled out, gasps filling the humid evening air. A voice from the crowd shouted, "He didn't do anything!" But they didn't stop. Elijah's face hit the concrete. He tasted blood, heard the crunch of bone near. His nose. The pressure of humiliation was heavier than the officer's knee. "I live here," he managed to whisper. But in their eyes, he didn't. He wasn't Elijah the father, or Elijah the hard-working man, or Elijah the quiet neighbor. He was a threat, a profile, a statistic. The scene ended with Elijah cuffed in the back of a squad car, his face swollen, his shirt soaked not just from sweat, but blood and spilled milk. His phone, which had fallen from his pocket, buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" The officers later claimed he was non-compliant, said he reached for something. But the videos told another story, a man standing still, surrendering, a man trying to speak. News spread quickly. The footage, grainy but clear, made its way onto social media. Hashtags formed. Justice for Elijah. The local police department released a vague statement. "We are reviewing the incident." But Elijah's face said enough. Doctors at the hospital treated a broken nose, fractured ribs, and severe bruising. He stayed there for 3 nights. His children visited once, too young to understand why their daddy was in a bed with tubes and tape instead of reading bedtime stories. Elijah tried not to cry in front of them. He held their hands gently, the same way he once held them when they took their first steps. Now they were holding him steady, but the pain wasn't just physical. It was deeper, older. The kind of wound inherited across generations. Wounds that never fully heal, just shift and scar. The community, once quiet, began to stir. Local churches spoke up. Community leaders demanded answers. And then something rare happened. The district attorney, herself the daughter of civil rights activists, announced charges. Not against Elijah, against the officers, a collective. Breath was held. The trial began 6 months later. Elijah, still healing, walked into the courtroom in a navy blue suit his brother loaned him. His hands trembled slightly as he took the stand. The jury, a diverse, attentive, listened closely as he recounted the day. He spoke slowly, not with anger, but with a kind of tired hope. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth. "I didn't think I'd die that day," he said quietly. "But I didn't think I'd be heard either." The prosecution played the videos. Frame by frame, the courtroom watched how he stood still, watched how he complied, watched how he was beaten anyway. The defense tried to spin. The officers feared for their safety, but the jury didn't buy it. Then came the moment of truth, the verdict. Guilty. Both officers convicted of excessive force, civil rights violations, and falsifying reports. It was the first conviction of its kind in the county's history. The local paper called it a turning point. Activists called it overdue. Elijah didn't smile as the verdict was read. He just closed his eyes and let a single tear fall. It wasn't just justice for him, it was validation for everyone who had ever been stopped, questioned, humiliated, and left with nothing but their dignity taken. In the weeks that followed, Elijah received letters. Hundreds of them. From strangers, from students, from single mothers, from veterans, people who had never met him but who saw themselves in him. He became a quiet symbol of resilience. He didn't do interviews. He didn't crave attention. But he did start showing up, to town halls, to school meetings, to rallies. Not to shout, but to listen, to hold space, to be present. He started a local initiative called Stand Still, offering workshops and resources for young men of color navigating life in places where they're seen as less than, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Elijah never returned to the warehouse. Instead, he found work mentoring at-risk youth, sharing his story, not to gain sympathy but to spark purpose. And when asked what kept him going, he said something simple. I have to live the kind of life my children can believe in. And so he did. Elijah's life didn't transform overnight. Justice, while necessary, didn't erase trauma. But it gave him something to build on, a platform not made of fame or outrage, but truth. He didn't set out to become a symbol. He just refused to stay broken. The days that followed were hard. Flashbacks came in waves. Loud voices behind him on the street would make him flinch. The sound of sirens at night still made his chest tighten. But therapy helped. Long walks, journaling, moments with his kids where laughter still lived. His daughter Maya once asked him if he hated the officers. Elijah didn't lie. I don't know if I hate them, he said, but I know I don't want to be like them. That's what defined him. Not his anger, but his choice, his refusal to let bitterness raise his children or shape his mind. Instead, he used his pain to light a path forward. Stand Still, the community initiative he founded, grew quietly but steadily. At first, just a handful of young men came to the weekly meetings. Most of them wore the same weary eyes Elijah had once seen in his own reflection. Boys told by the world they were dangerous before they'd even made a mistake. Elijah didn't lecture. He listened. He taught them to speak clearly, to write down their thoughts, to stand tall even when the world asked them to shrink. He told them, sometimes power doesn't come from speaking the loudest. It comes from refusing to stay silent when it matters most. Word spread. Local news covered his story again, this time not as a victim, but as a leader. More volunteers joined. A lawyer offered free legal literacy sessions. A counselor donated time for trauma therapy. And one afternoon, a teacher showed up with 10 boys who had each been suspended at least once just for acting suspicious in school. Elijah looked them in the eyes and said, "You're not suspicious. You're powerful. They just haven't figured that out yet." For some, it was the first time they'd ever heard anything like that. Meanwhile, the officers who had beaten Elijah were sentenced, one to 7 years, the other to 5. When asked to speak at the sentencing, Elijah declined. Let the truth speak for itself, he said. He wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in repair. Years passed. His son Jordan grew older and began asking questions, not just about the incident, but about the history behind it. Elijah would tell him the truth, even the hard parts. He believed that shielding children from pain didn't protect them. Preparing them did. One night, Elijah and Jordan stood outside looking at the stars. Jordan asked, "Were you scared that day, Daddy?" Elijah thought for a moment and said, "I was. But I was more scared that if I didn't survive, nobody would tell my side of the story." That answer stayed with Jordan for years. And in school, when a teacher assigned a project on local heroes, Jordan didn't write about an athlete or a celebrity. He wrote about his dad. He titled it, "The Man Who Stood Still." The paper ended with a quote, "He didn't shout. He didn't fight back. He didn't run. He stood still, and because of that, everything moved." The teacher cried when she read it. Eventually, Elijah was invited to speak at a national conference on justice reform. It wasn't his style. He didn't like stages or lights. But his daughter told him, "People need to hear you, Daddy, not for fame, for fire." He stood on the stage, quiet at first. The room held judges, police chiefs, activists, teachers, people who'd read headlines but hadn't lived what he lived. "I was beaten," he said. "But I wasn't broken. I was humiliated, but I wasn't erased. You want reform? Start with how you see us. Start with who you listen to. Start with how you treat the quiet man with the grocery bag." The silence after he spoke was louder than any applause. They gave him a standing ovation, but Elijah didn't smile for the cameras. He left the stage and flew back home that night, where his daughter was, waiting to show him her science project, and his son wanted help with math. Because for all the national attention, the real reward was always there. In his living room, in bedtime stories, in Sunday morning pancakes, he lived a life his children could believe in. Not because he never fell, but because he got back up. And every time he did, he reminded them, and the world, that dignity isn't given by courts or cops or systems. It's something you carry inside you, especially when they try to take it away. And so the man who was once profiled, beaten and humiliated, became a symbol not of pain, but of peace. Their father, a fighter, a man who stood still and changed everything. But Elijah's journey didn't end with courtrooms or community centers. What made his story echo so widely wasn't just the pain he endured, it was the quiet, relentless transformation that followed. He had become more than a man with a story. He became a mirror, reflecting back to society the questions it often avoids. Why is it so easy to judge? Why is fear so often louder than truth? Why are the ones meant to protect sometimes the ones we must be protected from? Elijah didn't have all the answers, but he never stopped asking the questions. His non-profit Stand Still expanded to cities across the country. They started chapters in schools, in libraries, even in juvenile detention centers. Not to lecture, but to listen. To create spaces where young black boys could speak without having to shout, where their fear wasn't dismissed, but understood. Every month, Elijah traveled to a different community. Sometimes the groups were big, sometimes just 5 or 6, but he gave them all the same message: you don't have to prove your worth, you were born with it. One day, in a small-town school gymnasium in Alabama, a teenager named Andre stood up and said, "Sir, how do you stay calm when they treat you like you're nothing?" Elijah paused, then smiled gently. "By knowing they don't get to decide who I am." That answer didn't just comfort Andre. It changed the way he walked, the way he spoke, the way he showed up in the world. And years later, when Andre graduated law school, he sent Elijah a note. It said, "They tried to define me, but you helped me define myself." That was the power of Elijah's legacy, not carved into stone, but planted in people. He never saw himself as a leader. He saw himself as a man who refused to disappear. He had days where he doubted, where he mourned, where he questioned if anything was changing at all. But every time he looked into his children's eyes, he remembered. This was bigger than headlines, bigger than speeches. This was about inheritance, not of money, but of meaning. And while some tried to make his story political, Elijah always made it personal. "This isn't about left or right," he told a journalist once. "This is about right and wrong." He never shouted. He never sought revenge. He just lived, deliberately, defiantly, peacefully. And that's what made him unstoppable. Years later, a documentary was made about his life. The final scene showed him sitting on his porch, older now, grey in his beard, his daughter braiding his hair while his son read a book beside him. The narrator said, "They tried to silence him, but he spoke through how he lived. They tried to humiliate him, but he raised his head higher. They tried to erase his dignity, but he left a trail of it everywhere he walked." The screen faded to black, and in the silence that followed, viewers around the country were left with more than just a story. They were left with a question: what do you do when the world tries to break you? Elijah's answer was simple. You stand still, you stay true, and you let your life be the proof. And so Elijah's story continued, not in the noise of media cycles or trending hashtags, but in the quiet acts of courage his journey inspired. In cities he never visited, young people carried his words like armor. Mothers whispered his name in prayer, hoping their sons would come home safe. Teachers printed his quotes on classroom walls, reminding students that history is not only written by presidents or politicians, but by ordinary people who refuse to surrender to injustice. In a high school debate club in Detroit, a young girl named Asha argued a case about civil rights reform. She didn't quote famous scholars or landmark rulings. Instead, she said, "There was a man named Elijah. They beat him. They tried to bury his dignity. But he taught us that pain can become purpose, if we choose it to be." Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. And in that room, she won more than the debate. She won the silence of realization, of her classmates realizing that justice is not abstract. Across the country, in a small diner in Mississippi, a retired officer hung up his badge. When asked why, he simply said, "I watched that trial. I saw Elijah's face, and I saw what we had become. I couldn't keep pretending it was someone else's problem." He didn't give speeches. He didn't write memoirs. But he mentored young cadets and reminded them that wearing a badge meant carrying a responsibility heavier than a gun. In New York, a mural went up, not of Elijah's face, but of two hands clasped together, one black and one white, beneath. The words, "Let the jury be our conscience." Tourists stopped to take photos, locals stopped to reflect. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer, but the mural remained. It became a landmark, not because of art, but because of memory. Elijah's children grew older. They didn't remember the trial in detail, but they remembered the lessons. His daughter Maya once told a classmate who teased her for being too serious that her father had taught her life was not a game, but a gift. She said, "People laughed at him, but now they quote him. He didn't fight with fists, he fought with truth, and truth always outlives fear." One rainy afternoon, long after the cameras were gone and the country's attention had drifted elsewhere, Elijah stood at his mother's grave. He hadn't spoken much about her, but that day he whispered, "I did what you said, I didn't let them turn me cold." And maybe that was his greatest victory. Not in court, not on social media, but in the fact that through everything he didn't become bitter. He didn't let hate take root in his heart. He stayed soft enough to feel and strong enough to rise. He showed the world that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet defiance of waking up, of walking outside, of daring to love your skin in a world that tries to fear it. He became a lighthouse, not by avoiding the storm, but by surviving it. And as that lighthouse stood, battered by waves yet unmoved, others began to steer toward it. People who had been afraid to speak, afraid to question, afraid to remember, they now found direction in his resolve. Survivors of brutality reached out to him, not for sympathy, but for solidarity. They didn't want pity. They wanted proof that healing was possible. And Elijah offered that, not as a man who claimed perfection, but as one who lived the ache and chose not to become it. One morning, a letter arrived at his doorstep. No name, no return address, just a folded piece of paper that read, "I was one of the officers. I didn't hit you, but I didn't stop them either. I tell myself that makes me less guilty, but you proved silence is a weapon too. I have a son. Now, I tell him about you. I tell him to be better than I was." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. The letter wasn't asking for forgiveness. It was a confession, a ripple of change started by a single man who refused to stay broken. Years passed. Laws shifted. Some were named after others, but activists knew whose footsteps led them there. College students wrote essays on systemic accountability. They quoted Elijah's testimony, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. He didn't speak in sound bites. He spoke like a man who had lived what textbooks couldn't explain. He said things like, "You can't fix what you won't face," and "Justice isn't a verdict, it's a mirror." A documentary was made, not about the beating, but about what came after. About a man who walked back into the very system that tried to destroy him, and demanded it answer for itself. The final scene showed him walking alone along a shoreline at dawn. No words, just the image of a survivor at peace. Not because the world had changed, but because he had chosen not to carry its darkness anymore. At schools, children began to learn his story, not as a warning, but as a lesson in resilience. A third-grade teacher in Atlanta once shared that her students called Elijah the man who didn't fall. They drew him with a cape, not because he flew, but because he stood when it mattered. His mother's Bible, worn and cracked, sat on his nightstand. He still read from it, especially the verse she'd always repeated, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." He didn't always believe it, but he tried. And in trying, he taught others that faith isn't certainty, it's persistence. Eventually, Elijah was asked to speak at a national forum. Politicians, activists, judges, all in attendance. But when he stepped on stage, he didn't speak about laws or policy. He said, "I came here not as a victim or a hero, but as a man who refused to forget his humanity. You can call me brave. But the truth is, I was just tired. Tired of pretending pain doesn't change us. Tired of pretending silence is neutral. I stood up because I had to, but I healed because I chose to." And in that room filled with the powerful and the privileged, it was not his scars that spoke, it was his peace. The peace of a man who had faced injustice, but chose not to become it, who had every right to hate, but instead chose to heal. He stepped down from that stage to a silence louder than applause. It was the kind of silence that comes when truth slices through pretense, when people realize they've been looking away for too long. A silence that demanded reflection. Elijah didn't need to see their faces to know something had changed, not just in the room, but within each person sitting there. Because his story wasn't about revenge, it wasn't even about justice, not in the way people often define it. It was about choosing, deliberately, daily, not to be reshaped by pain, about refusing to mirror the violence done to him. That night, as he walked back through the city, past the courthouse where it had all begun, he paused. The building loomed large, its columns and steps drenched in the glow of street lamps, but it no longer haunted him. It no longer held his memory captive. It was just a building now, no longer a symbol of trauma, but a backdrop in the story of a man who survived. In a small cafe nearby, he sat alone, sipping coffee, watching people pass. A teenage boy walked in with his father, excited, chattering about school and friends and life. Elijah smiled. Not because he knew them, but because he remembered a time when that kind of freedom felt distant. And now, he was watching it happen, in real time. He'd often wondered what legacy meant, if it was tied to speeches or names carved into plaques. But now he knew. Legacy is the quiet way your strength teaches others they're allowed to feel, to grieve, to rise. It's not measured in how loud you shout, but in how deeply you live. Years later, a new judge would quote Elijah in a ruling on police accountability. A school mural would be painted in his likeness, not as a martyr, but as a man with open eyes and open hands. And children would ask, "Who is he?" And their teachers would answer, "He's the man who reminded us that courage isn't just facing violence, it's choosing not to pass it on." Elijah never sought recognition. After the trial, he quietly resumed his life, not the life he had before, but the one forged in fire, tempered by truth. He moved to a quieter part of the state, where people didn't recognize his face on sight, where he could walk into a grocery store without whispered glances. But even there, even in quiet, the ripples of his story followed. One afternoon, while speaking at a small-town library to a handful of college students, he noticed a young woman in the front row, eyes wide, fists clenched in her lap. After the event, she approached him, her voice trembled. "My brother, he went through something like you did, but he didn't make it. I almost gave up. And then I found your story." Elijah didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded note. He carried many such notes, things he wrote to himself when the weight of it all felt unbearable. He handed one to her. It simply read, "They can take many things, but they cannot take your choice to be better." Tears streamed down her face. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't meant to fix her pain, but it reminded her she was not alone. Elijah's healing wasn't linear. Some days were good, some were dark. He still had moments when nightmares visited, when the sound of sirens sent a shiver down his spine. But he had learned something profound. Pain does not diminish you. Hiding from it does. He joined a small community initiative focused on helping victims of state violence reconnect with purpose. It wasn't about legal battles. It wasn't about protests. It was about healing, about showing up, about sitting silently with someone whose world had collapsed and saying, "I'm here, I've been there, and we're not done yet." Eventually, Elijah's name faded from headlines. The public moved on, as they always do, but the people he touched didn't forget. The jurors, the children who heard him speak, the officers who re-examined their conscience, the judge who whispered thanks when no one was listening, they carried him forward in the quiet choices they made after. One day, years later, Elijah was walking through a park when he passed a bench with a plaque, in honor of those who turned pain into power. No names, just a reminder. He sat there for a long time, watching children run, listening to the wind, feeling perhaps for the first time in years at peace. His story wasn't extraordinary because of what happened to him, but because of how he chose to live after. And in a world so quick to forget, Elijah reminded us, the human spirit, when committed to grace, can rewrite even the darkest chapters into pages of hope.